On a cold, dark morning, the most powerful man in Westeros knelt before the Red Keep and laid his head upon the block. He had been Hand of the King. He was grandfather to a king, and he was about to die on the order of the very woman he had spent his life trying to keep from the Iron Throne. His name was Otto Hightower. He was born a second son, with no crown to inherit and no great destiny waiting for him. Nothing in his birth promised power, and yet, by the end of his life, his blood sat upon the throne of the Seven Kingdoms. Few men in the history of Westeros climbed so far, but the throne was not empty when Otto reached for it. The realm already had an heir. Dragons already circled above it, and the careful old statesman who believed he could guide the future with patience and calculation would instead help drag his daughter, his house, and the whole realm into fire and ruin. This is the story of Otto Hightower, a man who spent his life building power step by careful step, only to watch everything he built collapse beneath the weight of the war he helped create. To understand Otto Hightower, you have to start with the city that made him. Oldtown is the oldest city in Westeros. It stood long before the Targaryens came with their dragons, long before Aegon raised his keep on the hill at King's Landing. It is a city of grey stone and old wealth, built where the honey wine flows down to the sea, and for centuries it was the largest and richest city in all the Seven Kingdoms. 3 great powers sat inside its walls: the Citadel, where the maesters are made, the order of grey-robed scholars who serve at every castle in the realm, keeping its records and counsel and ravens, the Starry Sept, the ancient stone heart of the Faith of the Seven, where the High Septon once ruled before the faith moved to King's Landing, and above them all, the High Tower itself. The High Tower is not a name borrowed from a sigil. It is a real thing, a vast tower of pale stone rising from an island at the mouth of the harbour, crowned with a beacon fire that burns through the night to guide ships home. It is one of the tallest structures ever raised by men in Westeros. The family that built it took its name from it and ruled the city from its heights. That family was House Hightower, old, proud, and immensely rich. They bent the knee to the Tyrells of Highgarden, who were named Wardens of the South, but in truth, the Hightowers were the grander house. They had been kings once, in the Dawn Ages, before they chose to fold their crown into a larger kingdom, rather than be destroyed defending it. That choice tells you something about them. The Hightowers were practical. They knew when to bow, and they survived where prouder houses fell. Into this house, Otto Hightower was born, but he was born in the wrong place in it. He was a younger son, not the heir. The lordship of Oldtown, the tower, the wealth, the ships, the seat on the high stone. All of that would pass to his elder brother, and then to his elder brother's children, and never to him. This is the oldest arithmetic in any noble house, and it is a cruel one. The first son inherits the world. The second son inherits a name and a problem. Consider what that meant, because it shaped everything Otto ever did. A second son of a great house grows up surrounded by power he will never own. He eats at the high table, but the chair at its head is not his and never will be. He wears fine cloth and rides good horses, all of it paid for by an inheritance that belongs to his brother. He is given the education of a lord and the prospects of a servant. He learns young that the things other men are simply handed, he will have to go out and take by other means. Some second sons drink their lives away on their brother's coin. Some take the black and go to the wall. Some find a sword and sell it, and die in some other lord's war. And a rare few look at the problem clearly and decide to climb. Otto Hightower decided to climb. He could not inherit power, so he learned to acquire it. The distinction sounds small, but it is the whole of the man. A lord who inherits power can be lazy and keep it. A man who must acquire power can never rest, because everything he holds was won, and anything that is won can be lost. Otto would carry that hunger his entire life. He never stopped reaching, because he had nothing beneath him to fall back on. The tool he chose was service. This was the path open to a clever, well-born man with no lands of his own. You attached yourself to someone greater than you. You made yourself useful to them. You handled the dull, difficult, thankless work that powerful men do not want to do themselves. The accounts, the letters, the petitions, the endless small decisions that keep a great house running. And if you did that work better than anyone else, you became something more valuable than a son. You became indispensable. Otto had the mind for it. He was intelligent, disciplined, and patient in a way that most ambitious men are not. Ambition usually burns fast and bright and gets a man killed. Otto's ambition was slow. He could wait years for a thing. He could hold a grudge across a decade and never let it show on his face. He understood that the men who win at court are rarely the loudest or the boldest. They are the ones who are still standing, still trusted, still in the room, when everyone louder has destroyed themselves. And he understood one further thing, an edge over rivals who came from less. House Hightower was not just rich. It controlled the citadel and stood close to the faith. A Hightower who reached the king's side did not arrive alone. He arrived trailing the quiet weight of Oldtown behind him. Its maesters, its septons, its gold. Otto knew how to suggest that weight without ever naming it. He could be a humble servant and a great lord's brother at the same time, and let the men across the table feel both. The man then, before the story truly begins. A second son with a first son's education and no first son's seat. A patient, careful, clever man who had learned to want things he was not born to have, and who had found, in service to the great, a ladder he could climb. He did not yet know how high it would take him. No one did. A second son of Oldtown might, in a good life, rise to be a respected steward, a trusted advisor, a name remembered fondly in his house for a generation or two. That was the ceiling. That was as far as the arithmetic of his birth was ever supposed to let him go. Otto Hightower would go much, much further. Keep that in mind as the rest of this story unfolds. The method never changed. The man you meet in these final years, the hand of the king, the maker of monarchs, the architect of a war, is the same man who started out as a landless younger son with nothing but his wits and his patience. He learned, early and permanently, that power would never be handed to him. He would have to take it, by being useful, by being patient, and by never, ever stopping. That hunger built him, but that is a long way off yet. For now, there is only a clever second son in the oldest city in Westeros, looking up at a tower he would never inherit, and deciding that he would climb a different one instead. A man who lives by service needs a great man to serve. Otto Hightower found the greatest of his age. His name was Jaehaerys, the first of that name, and by the time Otto came to his side, the old king was a legend grown frail. They called him the Conciliator and the Old King, and he had earned both. He had sat the Iron Throne for more than 50 years, longer than any Targaryen before or since. He had brought peace to a realm that had known little of it. He had outlived his wars, his rivals, and most cruelly, nearly all of his own children. When Otto reached him, Jaehaerys was an old man in a quiet hall, ruling a kingdom that had largely forgotten what it was like to bleed. Into the last years of that long reign, the king named Otto Hightower his hand. The office matters because everything in this story turns on it. The hand of the king is the second most powerful man in the Seven Kingdoms. He speaks with the king's voice and signs with the king's authority. When the king is strong, the hand carries out his will. When the king is weak, or old, or dying, the hand effectively runs the realm. There is a saying in Westeros, the king dreams and the hand builds. By the end of Jaehaerys' reign, the king mostly slept, and Otto built. For a second son of Oldtown, this was already a height almost beyond imagining. He had reached the very top of the ladder he had chosen, but Otto did not climb alone. He brought his family to King's Landing. The move would have looked at the time like nothing more than a careful father settling his household near his work. But it changes everything. Among the Hightowers who came to court was Otto's daughter. Her name was Alicent. She was young, clever, gracious, and by every account lovely, and her father placed her exactly where she would do the most good. He set her at the side of the dying king. Alicent became the old man's companion in his final decline. She read to him from histories and from the lives of dragons. She tended him, sat with him through the long grey afternoons, and brought him what comfort an old and lonely king can still take from the world. The court came to know her as a gentle, devoted presence in a hall full of people waiting for a man to die. To Jaehaerys, near the end, she may have been one of the few faces he was always glad to see. Now, the histories of this time do not all agree on what passed between the girl and the old king, and an honest telling has to say so. One account, set down years later by a court fool with a taste for filth and a gift for it, claimed that she did more than simply read to Jaehaerys. Other voices of the time, the Septons and the Maesters, said no such thing ever happened, that it was a slander invented to stain a great house. The truth is lost. What can be said is that the rumour existed, that it clung to Alicent for the rest of her life, and that whether or not it was true, it served a purpose. It told everyone at court that this girl had the ear and the affection of the king himself. In a place where nearness to the throne is the only currency that matters, that was a kind of power all its own. Whatever the truth of it, the arrangement reveals the father behind it. Otto had not simply secured himself a great office. He had woven his blood into the most intimate spaces of the royal household. His daughter was not a guest at court. She was a fixture of it, trusted, present, close. Then, in the year 103 after Aegon's conquest, the old king died. A lesser man's fortunes might have died with him. This is the danger every royal servant lives with. A hand serves at the king's pleasure, and when that king is gone, the new one is free to sweep the board clean and seat his own favourites. Many a powerful man has ridden a king's coffin straight out of the capital and into obscurity. The change of monarchs is the moment the climbers fall. Otto did not fall. The succession itself had been settled 2 years before, at a great council where the lords of the realm chose Jaehaerys' grandson Viserys to follow him. So when the old king breathed his last, there was no scramble for the throne. Viserys was crowned the first of his name, a generous, easygoing man who wanted to be loved and disliked conflict. And Viserys looked at the experienced, capable hand his grandfather had trusted, and he kept him on. The turning point of these early years is quieter than a battle, but no less important. Otto Hightower had served one king and survived to serve the next. he had proven the most useful thing a courtier can ever prove, that he was loyal to the office, not just to the man who held it. So consider where Otto stood when Viserys took the throne. He was Hand of the King, the second most powerful man in Westeros. His daughter was a known and trusted presence in the heart of the royal household. His house, the ancient and wealthy Hightowers of Oldtown, stood behind him. He had positioned every piece exactly where he wanted it, and he had done it before the real game had even begun. Because the great game of this story is not Jaehaerys' death. The old king died peacefully, in his bed, an heir already chosen. There was no crisis there, no opening to be exploited. The real game would be about who came after Viserys, and that question was not yet asked, because Viserys was newly crowned and the future seemed wide and untroubled. But Otto was already in the room where that question would one day be answered. That is the whole point of everything he had done. He had not maneuvered toward any single throne or any single crown. He had simply made certain that when the moment came, whenever it came, whatever shape it took, his family would be standing at the very center of the realm, close enough to reach for anything that came loose. Proximity to power was the foundation. Otto had spent years laying it, stone by careful stone. Everything he would ever build, every triumph and every catastrophe, would be raised on that single fact, that a second son of Oldtown had put himself and his blood inside the beating heart of the Seven Kingdoms, and meant to stay there. The heart of that realm was about to start beating faster, and the man best placed to feel the pulse was Otto Hightower. Every careful man eventually meets a reckless one who threatens to undo everything he has built. For Otto Hightower, that man was Prince Daemon Targaryen. Daemon was the king's younger brother. Where Viserys was soft and peace-loving and eager to be liked, Daemon was none of those things. He was a warrior, a dragon rider, and a danger. He carried Dark Sister, the ancient Valyrian blade of Queen Visenya herself, and he rode a lean red dragon called Caraxes, that men named the Blood Worm. He was charming when it suited him, and cruel when it suited him better. He wanted things, and he was not patient about wanting them. Above all, Daemon wanted to be near the throne. And for a long while, in the early years of Viserys' reign, with the king as yet without a living son, Daemon stood very near indeed. He was the heir's brother, then for a time the heir presumptive himself in the eyes of many. He had a claim, an army's worth of charisma, and a dragon. That is a frightening combination to set loose near a crown. The king, who loved his brother, kept trying to find him a place. He gave Daemon offices, and Daemon kept ruining them. Master of coin, where he spent more than he gathered. Master of laws, where he had no patience for the law. None of it took, because Daemon was not built to sit at a table and shuffle papers. And then Viserys gave him the one command that fit him, and Daemon made it his own. He was made commander of the city watch of King's Landing. The watch had been a shabby, half-corrupt rabble before him. Daemon transformed it. He drilled the men, armed them, and dressed them in cloaks of golden cloth, so that from then on the city watch of King's Landing was known by a single name, the Gold Cloaks. 2,000 armed men who patrolled the capital, kept the peace, and answered to Prince Daemon. He was wildly popular with them. He led them himself through the streets, and the small folk cheered him, and Daemon enjoyed every moment of it. To Otto Hightower, this was a nightmare taking shape in plain sight. Look at it through Otto's eyes. Here was a man with royal blood, a sword out of legend, a dragon, the love of the common people, and now 2,000 armed soldiers in the heart of the city, all of it held by someone who was rash, grasping, and one heartbeat from the throne. Everything Otto had spent his life building was the slow, patient work of stabilizing the realm around the king and his hand. Daemon was an open flame standing next to all of it. Otto looked at the prince and saw a fire that would sooner or later burn the house down. So Otto did what he did best. He went to work against him, quietly, the way he worked against everything. He whispered. At council and in the king's ear, he raised every concern, named every danger, recounted every reckless thing the prince had done, and let it sit. He did not rage against Daemon openly. He simply made sure that Viserys never quite stopped worrying about his brother, that every fresh outrage was remembered, that the prince's name carried a shadow with it wherever it went at court. And Daemon despised him for it. The contempt ran both ways, and it ran deep. To Daemon, Otto Hightower was the worst kind of man, a jumped-up second son, a servant born to no great seat, who had no dragon and no sword and no royal blood, and who had clawed his way to power by flattery and paperwork and putting his daughter near old men. Daemon was a prince of the blood of the dragon. He looked at Otto and saw a clerk wearing the chain of office above his station. He made no secret of the scorn. What made the hatred so bitter is worth pausing on. Each man saw in the other a reflection he refused to accept. Daemon was not wrong about Otto, and Otto was not wrong about Daemon. Each had simply chosen not to look too closely at the mirror. Both were ambitious past the point of reason. Both wanted to put their own line near the throne and keep it there. Both were ruthless, and neither had any real scruple about removing a rival who stood in the way. They were the same hunger wearing two different faces. The only true difference between them was method. Daemon reached for power through fire, the sword, the dragon, the bold stroke, the thing done in the open and dared anyone to answer. Otto reached for power through patience. The letter, the whisper, the slow campaign, the thing done so quietly that by the time you saw it, it was already finished. Each man recognized in the other exactly what he refused to see in himself. That is the deepest kind of hatred there is. For a long while it stayed a standoff. The king would not move against his own brother on the strength of his hand's warnings, however constant. Daemon was too charming, too useful in his way, and Viserys loved him. So the two men circled each other at court, the patient and the reckless, each waiting for the other to slip. And somewhere in those years, Otto stopped thinking of Daemon as a problem to be managed, but instead as a problem to be solved. The shift is a quiet one, made entirely inside one man's head, but it is the turning point. Containing a rival means you expect to live alongside him. Destroying one means you have decided he cannot be allowed to remain. Otto crossed that line. He concluded that Daemon Targaryen would never stop reaching for the throne, that he could not be reformed or satisfied or held in check forever, and that the realm and the Hightowers would only be safe once the prince was gone from it. From that point on, Otto was not waiting for an opening to control Daemon. He was waiting for an opening to be rid of him. The flaw at the center of Otto Hightower runs underneath everything that follows. His great gift was that he could spot a rival before anyone else did. He saw the danger in Daemon early and clearly, long before it bloomed, and in that he was right. But Otto had one blind spot he never escaped. He could not tell the difference between a threat to the realm and a threat to himself. In his mind, the two were always the same thing. What was good for Otto Hightower was good for the Seven Kingdoms, and a man who endangered Otto's standing was, by that fact alone, an enemy of the peace. It is a comfortable thing to believe when your standing keeps rising. It lets a man do ruthless things and call them duty. And for years it served him, because for years the things that protected Otto really did, more or less, protect the realm too. But the day would come when those two interests pulled apart, when defending his own line would mean tearing the kingdom in half, and Otto, who had spent a lifetime unable to see the difference, would not see it then either. That day was still far off, for now there was only the waiting and the watching, and the certainty hardening in Otto's mind that Prince Daemon Targaryen had to go. The opening he was waiting for was coming. It would arrive wrapped in tragedy. The opening Otto had waited for came, as such things often do, out of someone else's grief. Viserys had a queen, and her name was Aemma of House Arryn. She had been married to him young, and for years she had carried the heaviest burden a queen can carry, the need to give the realm a son. She had tried again and again. She had lost child after child, to miscarriage, to the cradle, to the long list of small graves that haunted the Targaryen line. Each loss took something out of her. By the year 105 after Aegon's conquest, she was worn thin by it, and pregnant once more, and the whole court held its breath, because everyone understood what was at stake. Viserys had a daughter, Rhaenyra, a bright and beloved girl. What he did not have was a son, and in the minds of most lords of the realm, only a son could truly settle the succession. The birth went wrong. It is enough to say that the labour was long and cruel, and that the maesters came to the king with a choice no man should have to make. There was a chance, they told him, to save the child if they acted, but doing so would cost the life of the mother. Viserys, who was desperate for a son, made his choice. The king who wanted only to be loved, who hated conflict and grief and hard choices, was broken open by the worst of all of them. The court reeled. The succession, which had seemed a question for some distant tomorrow, was suddenly raw and bleeding and unanswered. It was in that moment, with the king prostrate with sorrow, that Daemon made his mistake. The story that came down through the histories is this. While the king grieved, Prince Daemon was at his ease in the city, in the company of his friends and his pleasures, and he raised a cup. He drank, the tale says, to the dead infant, calling him the heir for a day. A toast made in the worst possible taste at the worst possible moment, mocking a dead child whose death had cleared the path back to the throne for Daemon himself. Now, honesty demands a caution here. We do not truly know that Daemon said it. The account comes down through sources that love to repeat the prince's cruelest moments, and a toast made in a brothel is exactly the kind of thing that grows in the telling. It may have been said exactly so. It may have been a coarser jape twisted into something colder. It may never have happened at all, and been invented later by men who wanted Daemon ruined. The truth is gone. But the words were spoken at court as though they were real, and at court that was enough, because Otto Hightower made certain the king heard them. This was the opening. Otto had been waiting years for Daemon to hand him a blade he could use, and Daemon had finally done it. The hand carried the toast to the grieving father, the prince, his own brother, joking about the death of the king's longed-for son, while the boy's body was barely cold. Otto did not need to invent anything or argue anything. He only had to repeat what was already being said to the one man in the realm whose grief was a raw wound, and let it do its work. It worked completely. Whatever love Viserys still held for his brother could not survive that. The king's grief turned to fury, and the fury fell on Daemon. the prince was stripped of his place at court and sent away from King's Landing in disgrace. The man who had styled himself the king's brother and the realm's protector, who commanded the love of the gold cloaks and the people of the city, was cast out, and the hand who had whispered against him for years stood by and watched it happen. It is hard to overstate what a victory this was for Otto. He had been trying to dislodge Daemon for as long as the two men had known each other, and now Daemon was gone, undone not by Otto's strength, but by his own arrogance. Otto had not had to strike the blow. He had only needed to let Daemon swing the sword and then guide the point toward the prince's own chest. And then came the second part, the part that mattered far more than Otto could have known. With his son dead and his brother disgraced, Viserys faced the question that would not wait. Who would follow him? He could have named Daemon, his brother and nearest male kin, but he had just cast Daemon out and would not now reward him. Instead, Viserys did something the realm had never done. He named his daughter. He summoned the lords of the Seven Kingdoms and had them swear solemn oaths to recognize the Princess Rhaenyra as the heir to the Iron Throne. A girl, a female heir, set above the king's own brother and any son that might come after. It was extraordinary, and it was binding, and hundreds of the realm's great men bent the knee and swore it before gods and men. Two things were true at once about that moment, and they pointed in opposite directions. Otto had finally rid himself of the Burning Man, the rival cleared from the board by his own folly. He won the court fight as completely as a court fight can be won. But underneath, something far larger had just occurred, and Otto could not see it, because the piece that would matter most did not yet exist. In helping to clear Daemon away, in standing beside a grieving king, as that king reshaped the succession, Otto had a hand in the creation of the single most dangerous thing in the realm, a contested inheritance, a named heir who was a woman, set above all the customs of the line, resting entirely on the oaths of lords who might one day find reasons to forget them. That was the first move that would end in war. Otto thought he had won a quarrel with a prince. What he had actually done was help plant a seed, and he could not yet see its shape. There was only a triumphant hand, a disgraced prince, and a little girl made heir to the most dangerous chair in the world. Otto had cleared the path. He simply did not yet know whose feet would one day walk down it. That changed within the year, because the king was now a widower, and Otto Hightower had a daughter. A year after he buried his wife and son, Viserys took a new queen. Her name was Alicent Hightower. The match surprised the realm, and it angered part of it. Most had expected the king to marry into House Valyrian, the great seafaring house of Driftmark, the wealthiest in the realm after the crown itself, bound to the Targaryens by blood and dragons both. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the famous sea lord they called the Sea Snake, had a daughter of the right age, and he expected the honor to fall to his line. It did not. Viserys passed over the Velaryons and chose the daughter of his hand instead. Corlys did not forget the slight, and that resentment would matter later, though not yet. For now, what mattered was this. A Hightower was queen of the Seven Kingdoms. How it came to pass is one of the questions the histories never settle, and it goes to the very center of who Otto Hightower was, so it is worth handling carefully. The hardest reading, and the one half the realm believed, is that Otto engineered the whole thing. By this telling, the patient schemer saw his moment the instant Queen Aemma died. He had a young, lovely, gracious daughter already installed at court. He placed her at the side of the grieving king, sent her to comfort him in his sorrow, and let nature and proximity do the rest. When the king's grief turned to attachment, Otto guided that attachment toward a marriage that would put his own blood on the throne. In this version, Alicent was a piece her father moved, and the wedding was the most brilliant maneuver of his life. The gentler reading, offered by others of the time, is that there was no grand scheme at all. By this telling, Alicent truly had been a comfort to Viserys, first to his dying grandfather, and now to the widowed king, and the two had grown genuinely fond of one another in the natural course of grief and companionship. The marriage, in this version, was a thing that simply happened, and Otto merely had the good fortune to be its father. And there was a third whisper, the ugliest one, carried by the same coarse source that had Daemon toasting a dead infant, that Alicent and the king were already lovers before any wedding, and that the marriage only made public what was already true. There is no good evidence for it, and it may be pure slander, but it was said. The truth lies somewhere among these, and we will never know exactly where. What can be said with confidence is the only thing that matters for this story. Whether Otto schemed for it or simply seized it, the outcome was the same. His daughter was queen, and he meant to make the most of it. A man does not need to have planned every step to know an opportunity when it lands in his lap, and Otto Hightower had never in his life let an opportunity pass unused. Understand what this meant for House Hightower. A second son of Oldtown had become the king's hand. Already further than such a man had any right to climb. Now that same man was the king's good father, the grandfather of any children the new queen might bear. His blood was no longer merely near the throne. It was about to sit upon it. For an ambitious house, there is no greater prize in all the world than to put your daughter's children in the line of kings. Otto had done exactly that, and the children came. In the year 107 after Aegon's conquest, Alicent gave the king a son. They named him Aegon after the conqueror, a name that carries the weight of the whole dynasty, a name you do not give a child you intend to keep small. Then came a daughter, Helena, then another son, Aemond, and in time a third son, Daeron. 4 true-born children of the king, healthy and growing, with the blood of old Valyria in their veins and the blood of the Hightowers beside it. A second royal bloodline now existed in the Red Keep. The realm had one named Heir, the Princess Rhaenyra, daughter of the king's first marriage, to whom hundreds of lords had sworn solemn oaths. And now the realm also had true-born sons of the king. And in the 7 kingdoms, the old custom, the custom in nearly every lord's heart, whatever oaths his mouth had spoken, was that a son comes before a daughter. Always. The oaths to Rhaenyra had been sworn in a time when she was the king's only child. Now there were boys. Boys who, by every instinct the realm had been raised on, stood ahead of any sister in the line. Either the named heir would inherit, breaking the oldest custom of the realm, or the king's eldest son would inherit, breaking the most solemn oath the lords had ever sworn. There was no path that honored both. The realm needed one heir, and it had been given 2. No one said this aloud, not yet. Viserys, who hated conflict above all things, simply behaved as though no contradiction existed. Rhaenyra was still his heir. He insisted on it, and would insist on it to his dying day. The boys were merely his beloved sons. The king built a comfortable silence around the problem and lived inside it, and told himself the question would somehow answer itself. But Otto Hightower was not capable of that kind of silence. Otto saw the contradiction perfectly, because Otto had spent his whole life seeing exactly this kind of thing. The gap between what men swore and what men would do. The difference between the law on the page and the custom in the gut. He looked at his infant grandson Aegon, a true-born son of the king carrying the conqueror's own name, and he did the thing he had always done. He began to think about the future and to position for it, quietly, carefully, without a word that could be repeated against him. Otto began to think of his grandson as a king. The Hightowers had until now been beside the throne, trusted servants, valued advisors, the people in the room. With Alicent's marriage and the birth of her sons, that changed forever. They were no longer near the line of succession. They were in it. Otto's own grandson had a claim to the Iron Throne. The customs of the realm could be made to favor it, if the right man worked patiently enough. The insight that everything after will only make plainer is this. With the marriage of his daughter and the birth of her sons, Otto Hightower created a collision. Two heirs now stood where the realm could only have one. Otto did not start that collision out of malice. He may not have fully meant to start it at all, but he is the man who created the conditions for it, more than any other single person in the realm. He put a Hightower in the king's bed, and Hightower blood in the line of kings, and in doing so, he set two heirs on a path toward one throne. He had spent his life learning to be patient. Now he had the one thing patience was made for: a grandson who might be king, and decades to wait for the moment to make it so. He overreached before he learned how long that wait would have to be. Otto Hightower's great strength was patience. And the strange thing about his first great fall is that it came from the one moment he forgot how to be patient. He had everything in place. His daughter was queen. His grandson Aegon was a true-born son of the king. The contradiction in the succession sat there in the open for anyone with eyes to see it. A named daughter on one side, true-born sons on the other. All Otto truly had to do was wait. Wait for Aegon to grow. Wait for the lords of the realm to remember their instincts. Wait for the king to age, and for the question of who would follow him to become unavoidable. Time was working for Otto. Every year that passed, his grandson grew older, and his claim grew firmer in the minds of men. But waiting requires faith that the future will arrive, and Otto could not quite hold that faith. The prize was too close and too fragile. Rhaenyra was still the named heir, still the king's beloved daughter, and every day she remained so was a day the throne moved further from Aegon. So Otto, the most patient man in Westeros, did the impatient thing. He began to push. He pushed at court, in council, in the king's ear. He raised the question that Viserys most wanted left alone, the question of the succession. He pressed the case for Aegon. He argued, in the careful, reasonable way he argued everything, that the realm's instincts favored a son, that the oaths to Rhaenyra had been sworn before the king had sons, that wisdom and stability lay in setting things right, while it could be done peacefully. Every word of it served House Hightower. And Otto, true to the blind spot he had carried his whole life, almost certainly believed every word of it served the realm as well. The trouble was that Aegon was a small boy. He was barely 5 years old. To advocate for him over Rhaenyra was not a subtle policy argument. It was a naked demand that the king disinherit the daughter he loved in favor of the grandson of his own hand. However gently Otto dressed it, that was what it was, and it could not be dressed gently enough to hide. Viserys saw it. He may have been a soft king and a conflict-avoiding man, but he was not a stupid one, and on this one subject he had a will of iron. He loved Rhaenyra. He had named her his heir before gods and lords, and he meant to keep his word. He had spent years building a careful silence around the contradiction in his own household, refusing to choose between his daughter and his sons, holding the peace by simply not looking at the problem. And now his own hand would not let him look away. Worse, his own hand was pushing him relentlessly and from a position of trust toward the one outcome the king had decided he would never accept. And Viserys saw something else, something more dangerous to Otto than any single argument. He saw the ambition behind the council. He understood, at last, that the man giving him advice was not a neutral servant weighing the good of the realm. He was a grandfather pushing for his own grandson's crown. Every recommendation Otto made, however reasonable it sounded, pointed in exactly one direction, toward the throne for the Hightowers. Once a king sees that, he can never quite hear his hand the same way again. Every word becomes suspect. Every counsel carries a hidden price. So Viserys did something that surprised the court and must have stunned Otto. He removed him. The king stripped Otto Hightower of the office of Hand of the King. The chain of office passed from him to Sir Lionel Strong, the Lord of Harrenhal, a learned, capable man with no royal grandchildren and no horse in the succession race, which was very likely the entire point. Lionel Strong could advise the king without an agenda of his own, and that was suddenly worth more to Viserys than all of Otto's brilliance. And Otto, the second son, who had climbed so far from Oldtown, was sent back to it. He returned home, out of power, out of the room, far from the throne he had spent his life maneuvering toward. The fall was not bloody. He kept his head and his honors and his house, but he had been cast down all the same, and everyone in the realm knew why. The hand had reached for too much, too openly, and the king had slapped the hand away. Faced with a choice between his daughter and his hand, between the heir he loved and the advisor who served him so well, Viserys chose his daughter. Otto had overreached, and he was sent home for it. The most revealing thing about Otto Hightower is the lesson he took from that fall. A different man might have concluded that his ambition was the problem, that reaching for the crown was a kind of treason against the king who trusted him. That is the lesson Viserys hoped to teach. Otto drew a different lesson entirely. He had let his hand be seen. He had pushed where he should have waited, argued where he should have only suggested, made his ambition visible to a king who could not afford to indulge it. In Otto's mind, the fault was the showing. And so the years in Oldtown that followed were not years of repentance. They were years of refinement. Otto did not give up his grandson's claim. He did not stop believing that Aegon should be king and that the Hightowers should rise. He simply resolved that he would never again let it show. He would learn to want things in silence. He would learn to advise without seeming to scheme, to position without seeming to push, to move toward the throne so quietly that no king would ever again catch the ambition in his eye. People would say, in the years to come, that Otto Hightower had learned patience from his fall. They would be only half right. He had not learned patience. He already had patience. That had never been his problem. What he learned in Oldtown was concealment. He learned to hide. The hand had been seen once. It would not be seen again until it was too late to slap it away. And while Otto sat in Oldtown perfecting his patience, the court he had left behind began, slowly, to split in two. When Otto Hightower left for Oldtown, he might have hoped the quarrel he had started would fade without him to tend it. It did the opposite. The division he had planted, no longer needed the man who planted it. It had taken root in something far stronger than a hand's ambition. It had taken root in two mothers. At the center of the court now stood two women, and they had come to hate each other. The first was Queen Alicent, Otto's daughter, mother of the king's sons, the woman who carried her father's cause, whether her father was in the room or not. The second was the Princess Rhaenyra, the king's beloved firstborn, his named heir, raised from childhood to believe the throne would one day be hers. The two had once been close, in the way of young women thrown together at court. Those days were long gone. What stood between them now could not be repaired, because it was not really about either of them. It was about their children. What made the enmity so much more dangerous than any ordinary court rivalry was this. For Alicent, every day that Rhaenyra remained the heir was a day that brought her own sons closer to a terrible fate, because the realm understood a hard truth that no one liked to say aloud. A queen who takes the throne in her own right cannot easily suffer rival claimants to live. Rhaenyra's sons and Alicent's sons could not both have futures. If Rhaenyra became queen, what became of Aegon, a boy with a claim of his own and the blood of the conqueror in his name? A claimant left alive is a rebellion waiting to happen. Alicent was not merely fighting for her children's status. She had come to believe she was fighting for their lives. And Rhaenyra believed exactly the same thing in reverse. Every year, Alicent's sons grew older. Her own claim grew more endangered. And the smiling boy with the right name became more clearly the weapon that would one day be used to unmake her. Each woman looked across the court and saw in the other's children the thing that would destroy her own. That is not a rivalry. That is a war that has not started shooting yet. The moment it took on its lasting shape came at a tourney. The court gathered for a great tournament, as courts did, a day of pageantry and colour, and the whole realm's nobility on display. And on that day, the two women made their division visible to every lord and lady present, in the simplest and most lasting way imaginable. The queen came dressed in green. The princess came in the black and red of House Targaryen. It seems a small thing, a choice of gown. It was anything but. In a court that had learned to speak in silences and signals, two colours said everything that no one was permitted to say in words. The green of the Hightowers, the black and red of the dragon. From that day forward, the realm had a language for the thing tearing it apart. The Queen's party became the Greens. The Princess's party became the Blacks. The factions had their names, and once a thing has a name, it has a life. You can take a side. You can declare for one colour or the other. The quiet, unspoken split in the king's household had become something men could openly belong to, and belong to it they did. The lords of the realm began, quietly at first, and then less quietly, to choose. Some leaned green toward the queen and her sons, and the old custom that put a boy before a girl. Some leaned black toward the princess and the oaths they had sworn to her. They did not march anywhere yet. They did not raise banners or call their swords. But in the back of every great lord's mind, a question was being settled. When the king dies, where do I stand? The court was no longer simply a court. It was two camps, sharing the same halls, smiling at the same feasts, each quietly counting the strength of the other. Through all of this, Alicent never wavered. And here is the part that matters most for the story of her father. Otto was not there. He was in Oldtown, out of office, far from the Red Keep, stripped of the power to push his grandson's cause. By every ordinary measure, his great project should have stalled. the schemer was gone from the board, but his daughter carried it for him. Alicent had become her father's cause made flesh. Whether she did it because he had shaped her to it, or because she had come to believe in it utterly on her own, or because a mother fighting for her sons needs no one to instruct her in the fight, the result was the same. The Hightower interest at court no longer depended on Otto Hightower being in the room. It walked and breathed and schemed without him, in the person of the Queen. She gathered the greens to her. She kept her son's claim alive in the minds of lords. She did, year after year, the work her father would have done, and she did it from inside the marriage and the household, where no one could simply dismiss her and send her home. The court had stopped being a court during those years of Otto's absence. It had become two armies in waiting, armies that had not yet found their battlefield, armies still wearing silk instead of steel, but armies all the same, drawn up in two lines and waiting only for the one event that would loose them: the king's death. Everyone knew it was coming. Everyone was, in their hearts, already getting ready. Otto's ambition had outgrown Otto. He had started this. He had put his daughter in the king's bed and Hightower blood in the line of kings, and pushed, too hard and too soon, for his grandson's crown. But the thing he set in motion had now grown so large that it no longer needed him. It ran on its own. It had its own colours, its own factions, its own momentum. It was carried forward by his daughter and her fears for her children, by lords making their private calculations, by the simple, unbearable fact of two heirs where the realm could hold only one. Otto could have died in Oldtown in those years, forgotten and out of power, and the war he had seeded would still have come. He had meant to steer the future. Instead, he had released it. He was not finished, though. He was not a man who stayed in Oldtown forever. The court that had split in two would soon need a steady hand again, and when that need came, there was only ever going to be one name on the king's lips. The fire that would call Otto back was already, somewhere far to the north, beginning to catch. In the year 120 after Aegon's conquest, the great castle of Harrenhal burned in the night. Harrenhal is the largest castle ever raised in Westeros, a vast and brooding pile of stone on the shore of the God's Eye, and it has a grim reputation. It was built to be unconquerable, and then on the day it was finished, Aegon the Conqueror flew his dragon over its towers and melted them like candles. Ever since, men have said the place is cursed, that no house holds it for long, that those who rule from Harrenhal come to ruin. On that night, the curse seemed to prove itself again. The castle's lord was Sir Lionel Strong, the very man Viserys had chosen to replace Otto as Hand of the King, the learned and steady advisor with no royal grandchildren and no stake in the succession. He had gone home to Harrenhal on the king's business, and his eldest son had gone with him. That son was Sir Harwin Strong, called Breakbones, one of the strongest knights in the realm, a man whose name had been tangled up in the ugliest rumours at court. When the fire took the castle, it took them both. The Hand of the King and his heir died together in the flames. No one could say for certain how the fire started, and that uncertainty has never been settled. Some called it an accident, the curse of Harrenhal doing what it always did. Others whispered that it was no accident at all, that someone wanted Lionel and Harwin dead, and that the man who profited most was Lionel's own surviving son, the clever, crippled Larys Strong, called the Clubfoot, who inherited Harrenhal in their place and who had ties to the Queen's party. There is no proof. There never was. It is one of the dark, unanswerable questions that haunt this history, and we can only note the suspicion and move on, the way the realm itself did. What mattered, immediately and practically, was that the seat of the Hand of the King was suddenly empty, and the king who had to fill it was not the king who had dismissed Otto 8 years before. Viserys had aged. More than aged, he had decayed. The easygoing, peace-loving man had grown into a sick and swollen monarch, his body failing him in ways that grew worse each year. He was plagued by ailments, weighed down by a flesh that would not heal, increasingly tired of the burdens of rule. He had spent his entire reign avoiding hard choices, and the years of avoidance had piled up around him into a great unanswered question that loomed over everything. Who would follow him? The succession was still unresolved. Rhaenyra was still his named heir, the Greens still gathered around his queen and her sons, and the realm drifted year by year toward a reckoning that everyone could feel coming and no one would speak aloud. A drifting realm and a dying king need one thing above all, a capable hand. And Viserys, looking around at the men available to him, made the choice that must have cost his pride something to make. He recalled Otto Hightower. Think about what that meant. This was the man Viserys had cast out for exactly this reason, for letting his ambition show, for pushing his grandson's claim, for being unable to separate the good of the Hightowers from the good of the realm. None of that had changed. Otto was still Aegon's grandfather. He still wanted what he had always wanted. The king knew all of this perfectly well, and he sent for him anyway. He did it because he had no better choice, and because he was old and tired, and the realm was hard to govern. Otto Hightower was simply the most capable man for the office. He knew the court, knew the lords, knew the machinery of rule better than anyone living. A failing king does not have the energy to train a green hand or to fence endlessly with an ambitious one. He wants the work done by someone who knows how. So the king swallowed whatever misgivings he still held and put the chain of office back around the neck of the man he had once torn it from. The Otto who came back had spent 8 years in Oldtown, perfecting the one lesson his fall had taught him. Not to want less, but to hide the wanting better. He returned, smoother, quieter, more careful. He came back as the indispensable old hand, the steady grey presence who had served the realm across 2 reigns and knew where every body was buried. He did not push now. He did not need to. He had learned that the throne would come to his grandson on its own, if only he could be standing in the right place when the moment arrived. His whole task now was simply to be that, to be present, to be useful, to be trusted, and to wait. The turning point Otto had been building toward his entire life, without perhaps fully knowing it, was now within reach. The first time he fell, the king had been strong enough on this single subject to dislodge him. Now Viserys was too sick, too tired, too dependent on his hand's competence to ever again summon the will to send him away. Otto had returned to power at the exact moment the man above him lost the strength to police him. He was back in the heart of the realm, beside the throne, with the king's authority in his hand, and a dying king too weak to take it back. And he meant to stay there until the only event that mattered finally came. That event was the king's death. Otto Hightower's defining trait was patience, and in this recall, his patience finally, fully paid. He had wanted one thing for the better part of his life, to be standing at the center of power, with his hand on the levers of the realm, when Viserys died and the succession came open. For decades the moment had eluded him. He had been near it, lost it, been sent home, watched from Oldtown while his daughter carried the cause without him. And now, at last, in the king's final years, he was exactly where he needed to be. Hand of the king, grandfather to a prince, trusted, entrenched, and unremovable, positioned with perfect precision for the single event he had been waiting decades to seize. All that remained was for the old king to die, and the old king was dying. Anyone who looked at Viserys could see it. The realm held its breath. The Greens and the Blacks each made their quiet preparations, and Otto Hightower settled into his recovered office and waited for the thing he had given his whole life to be ready for. He did not have to wait much longer. For years, the whole realm had been waiting for one man to die, and in the year 129 after Aegon's conquest, he finally did. Viserys had been failing for a long time. The decline that began as ailments in his middle years had become, by the end, a slow and total unmaking. His body was eaten away by sickness. He lost pieces of himself to it, lost his strength, lost his mobility, lost at last nearly everything but the crown on his head and the will to keep avoiding the one question he had spent his entire reign refusing to answer. He was not so much a ruling king anymore as a dying one being ruled around. The realm was governed by his hand and his council and his queen. The king himself was mostly a body to be tended, a presence to be waited upon, and an event that everyone in the Seven Kingdoms was, in their private hearts, preparing for. And both sides were preparing. The Greens gathered around Queen Alicent and her sons, with Otto Hightower restored as hand at the very centre of them. The Blacks gathered around the Princess Rhaenyra, who by now had been sent to live on Dragonstone, the ancient Targaryen island seat, away from the capital and the queen who hated her. Two camps, two heirs, two futures, all of them holding their breath and watching a sick old man fail by inches. Everyone knew that the moment his heart stopped, the long-postponed reckoning would begin. One fact never changed through all of it, and it must be stated as plainly as possible. On paper, Rhaenyra was still the heir. Viserys never unmade it. For all the pressure of the Greens, for all his queen's ambition and his hand's careful presence, the king never revoked his daughter's claim. He never set aside the oaths. The hundreds of lords who had knelt and sworn to recognize Rhaenyra as the heir to the Iron Throne had never been released from those vows. To his last day, by every law and document and solemn oath the realm possessed, the named successor of King Viserys was his daughter. The king had spent his whole reign avoiding the choice between his daughter and his sons, and he died still avoiding it, which is to say, he died having made it, because to never revoke Rhaenyra's claim was to leave it standing. The seam where truth and convenience would soon part ways must be handled with care. After the king was dead, the Greens would tell a story. They would claim that in his final days, Viserys had changed his mind, that he had at the last confided a wish for his son Aegon to follow him, that the dying king had quietly undone in private what he had so publicly built. It is possible. Sick and exhausted men say many things at the end, and the people around a deathbed are not always honest about what they heard. But it is just as possible, and far more likely, that the claim was invented after the fact by the people who needed it to be true. The men who repeated it were precisely the men it served. The Blacks called it a lie outright, a tale stitched together to dress a theft in the colours of the king's own will. We cannot know. The truth of those final hours died with the man, and what survives is only the contested word of people with everything to gain. So set the deathbed whispers aside, because they do not change the only thing that can be verified. Whatever Viserys may or may not have murmured to whoever was in the room, he had not changed a single document, a single oath, a single law. The realm's official, sworn, recorded position on the morning the king died was exactly what it had been for more than 20 years. Rhaenyra was the heir. Then, on the night Viserys died at last, the Greens made their move. They did not weep in public and proclaim the king's daughter their new queen. They did the opposite. They kept the king's death close, contained, controlled, while they did the work of seizing the moment they had waited so long for. The machinery that Otto Hightower had spent his life building and positioning began, in the hours after the old king's heart stopped, to turn. The hinge on which Otto's entire moral story swings is this: the king died with his heir undisturbed on paper. That single fact removes every excuse that history would later try to hand to the men who acted next. If Viserys had publicly disinherited Rhaenyra, if he had stood before the lords and unmade his daughter's claim and named Aegon in her place, then crowning Aegon would have been obedience. It would have been carrying out the will of the king. But that is not what happened. Viserys did no such thing. He left the throne to his daughter, in law and in oath, exactly as he had for 2 decades, which means that what Otto Hightower was about to do was not to follow an instruction. It was to overrule one. When Otto set out to crown Aegon, he was overturning his dead king's decree, not obeying it. The named heir was Rhaenyra. The sworn heir was Rhaenyra. The lawful heir, by every measure the realm recognized, was Rhaenyra. To put Aegon on the throne instead was not loyalty to Viserys. It was treason against everything Viserys had decreed. And Otto knew it. No man simply caught up in events would do what Otto did next. He was not confused about the law. He had served the realm across 3 kings. No one alive understood the oaths and the precedents and the documents better than he did. He knew exactly what Rhaenyra's claim was and exactly how it had been established, because he had stood at court while much of it was made. When he chose to set it aside and crown his grandson, he did so with his eyes fully open, understanding precisely what it was. He was the most informed man in the realm about the wrong he was about to commit. He could tell himself, as he always had, that he was serving the realm, that a son truly belonged before a daughter, that the oaths had been a mistake, that stability lay with Aegon. The blind spot he had carried his whole life let him believe it. But belief is not the same as truth, and Otto was far too clever a man not to know the difference, even as he chose to act against it. The decades of patience were over. The waiting was done. The one event Otto had built his entire life around had finally arrived, with the law standing squarely against him. Now he would have to decide what to do about that. In the hours and days after Viserys breathed his last, Otto Hightower gathered the men he trusted behind closed doors to make the most consequential decisions in the history of the 7 kingdoms. They called it a council. History would remember it by the color they wore. In the hours after the old king died, while the rest of the Red Keep still believed Viserys slept, Otto Hightower gathered his people behind a closed door and set about stealing a throne. This was his council. He was its architect. Everything that had happened across the long decades, the marriage of his daughter, the birth of her sons, the patient years in Oldtown, the careful recall to power, had been building, knowingly or not, toward exactly this room and exactly this moment. The king he had waited for was dead. The throne he had spent his life maneuvering toward was, for the space of a few days, an unclaimed thing. And Otto meant to claim it before the rest of the realm even knew the seat was empty. He had the right men around him. The Queen, his daughter Alicent, the Grand Maester, Orwyle, keeper of the realm's records and writer of its letters, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Sir Criston Cole, a hard and devoted soldier who had bound himself body and soul to the Queen's cause, the Master of Whisperers, the clever and crippled Larry Strong, who knew every secret in the city, the Master of Coin, the Master of Laws, the men who held the strings of money and the law and the spies. These were the Greens, the faction that had grown up around Alicent across all those years of quiet division, and now, with the king dead, they were no longer a faction at court. They were a government preparing to seize a kingdom. The first decision was the one the whole conspiracy rested on, and it was made quickly because everyone in the room had already made it long ago in their hearts. They would crown Aegon. They would set aside Rhaenyra, the named and sworn heir, and put the king's eldest son on the Iron Throne in her place. There was no real debate about whether to do it. The only debates were about how, and the hardest of those debates was about blood. Because once you have decided to take a crown from its rightful heir, you are left with a terrible problem. The heir is still alive. Rhaenyra sat on Dragonstone with her sons and her dragons, and as long as she lived, she was a rallying point, a living, breathing claim that every disaffected lord in the realm could gather behind. The cold logic of usurpation is brutal and simple. A claimant left alive is a war left unfinished. There were voices in that room who understood this perfectly and who argued the ruthless course, that Rhaenyra and her sons must die. Kill the claimants, and there is no one left to claim. Secure the throne not with terms and treaties, but with the only thing that truly ends a rival cause, which is the end of the rival. It was the kind of argument that wins wars, and Otto Hightower argued against it. The moment reveals the man more clearly than any other in his whole story. At the very instant of his greatest crime, plotting to overthrow the lawful heir of a king he had served for decades, Otto Hightower was the voice of restraint in the room. He did not want a slaughter. He argued for the measured course, the course that had always been his by instinct. Crown Aegon swiftly, secure King's Landing, win over the great lords with letters and bargains and marriages, and then, rather than send killers to Dragonstone, send terms. Offer Rhaenyra a way to live. Let her keep her island seat. Let her sons inherit their lands. Grant pardons all around, if only she would bend the knee and accept her brother as king. Make the usurpation a thing the realm could swallow, a fact too settled and too bloodless to be worth a war. There was something in this of his daughter too. Alicent had hated Rhaenyra for years, but Rhaenyra was still her husband's child, still a girl she had once known, and the histories suggest the Queen had no stomach for ordering her murdered outright. Mother and father, Queen and Hand, both leaned the same way for their own reasons. Take the throne, yes, but try to take it without drowning the realm in kin's blood. You can see, in this, everything Otto had ever been. He was a man who had spent his entire life winning through patience, persuasion, and leverage, rather than through force. He had destroyed Daemon not with a sword, but with a whisper. He had raised his house not by conquest, but by service and marriage and the slow accumulation of position. The man simply did not think in terms of fire and slaughter. He thought in terms of management, of arrangements made, of rivals contained, of conflicts negotiated down to something everyone could live with. So even now, even with a throne to steal, his instinct was to steal it carefully, to manage the war rather than to win it. And so, the council made its choice. They would usurp the throne, but they would try to do it the measured way. Crown the boy, secure the city, offer the woman terms. With this decision, Otto committed the realm to taking the crown from its named heir. There was no walking it back after this. The moment the Greens resolved to put Aegon on the throne over Rhaenyra, the dance of the dragons became inevitable, whether they offered terms or not. Otto Hightower, who had spent decades inching toward this exact end, finally crossed the line he had been approaching his whole life. He chose treason, with his eyes open, and dressed it in the language of duty and the realm's good, as he had always dressed his ambitions. His instinct, at the very birth of the war he was starting, was to manage it rather than to win it. He wanted to take the crown without the slaughter, to make the usurpation gentle enough that it might not have to be a war at all. It is, in a strange way, the most decent impulse he ever showed, because usurping a throne is not a thing you can do gently. Once you have taken a throne from its rightful heir, you have made an enemy who cannot be appeased with terms, because the only term that would satisfy her is the throne itself, and that is the one thing you cannot give back. Otto's measured course gave Rhaenyra exactly what a measured course always gives a wronged claimant: time. Time to gather her dragons, time to rally her lords, time to refuse his terms and answer the theft with fire. The careful, bloodless path Otto wanted was a path that could not exist. There was only the doing of it, and the war that had to follow. The hard men in that room who wanted Rhaenyra dead were monsters, but they understood something Otto did not want to understand. If you are going to commit this crime, half measures will destroy you. And Otto, the most careful planner in Westeros, was about to spend the war committing half measures, offering terms, managing, restraining, negotiating, while the people around him grew more and more certain that what the war needed was not management, but blood. That difference between the man who wanted to manage the war and the men who wanted to win it would cost Otto everything. But that was still to come. First, there was a boy to crown. He had not even been asked yet whether he wanted the crown his grandfather was about to place on his head. As it happened, he did not. Prince Aegon was not the eager young king of a grandfather's dreams. He was a disappointment, and not a quiet one. He had grown into a prince of idle appetites, a man more interested in wine and pleasure and the rough amusements of the city than in the burdens of rule. He had no great hunger for the throne, no patient ambition like his grandfather's, no sense of destiny driving him toward the Iron Throne. When the Greens went looking for him in the hours after the king died, ready to make him a monarch, they had to go and find him, because he was not waiting by the throne for his moment. He was off in the city, living the life he preferred, with no idea that his grandfather was about to upend the realm to put a crown on his head. And when they found him and told him what they intended, he was reluctant. The accounts differ on the shape of his reluctance, but they agree on the fact of it. He understood, perhaps better than the men pushing him, what taking the crown would mean. It would mean war with his sister and her dragons. It would mean that he, a man who wanted to be left to his pleasures, would have to become the figure at the center of a struggle that could swallow the realm. He may have feared it. He may simply have not wanted the trouble. He raised the question that hung over the whole enterprise. What would become of Rhaenyra and her children? But in the end, reluctance is no match for a council that has already decided your future for you. Otto and the Greens had not waited decades to be turned aside by the hesitation of the boy they meant to crown. They persuaded him. They pressed him. and Aegon, who did not want to be king, agreed to be made one. There is a bitter irony buried in this that runs to the very heart of Otto's tragedy. The man had given his entire life to reaching this single moment, to placing his blood on the throne of the Seven Kingdoms, and the blood he was placing there did not even want to sit. The crown that meant everything to Otto meant little to Aegon, but it did not matter what Aegon wanted. Aegon was never the point. Aegon was the vessel. He carried the conqueror's name and the king's blood, and a claim the Greens could rally behind, and that was all the grandfather needed him to be. Whether the boy desired the throne or dreaded it changed nothing about the plan. So they crowned him, and they did it in the grandest, most public way they could devise. The coronation was staged at the Dragon Pit, the great dome structure on the hill of Ruinous, where the Targaryens kept their dragons. The Greens did not slip a crown onto Aegon's head behind closed doors. They threw open the doors. They brought him before the people of King's Landing. Thousands upon thousands of the city's small folk gathered to witness a king made. This was deliberate, and it was clever, and the cleverness was Otto's kind of thinking. A king crowned in secret is a usurper. A king crowned before a roaring crowd of his own people is something that begins to look like a king. The Greens understood that legitimacy is partly a thing you perform, and they performed it with everything they had. Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander who had bound his sword to the Queen's cause, set the crown upon Aegon's brow. The boy who had not wanted it stood before the multitude as Aegon II of his name, King of the Andals and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. His sister wife Helena stood beside him, and to seal the spectacle, the dragons were there, the great golden beast Sunfire, Aegon's own, a living reminder that this king came with fire at his back. The crowd roared its approval, and in that roar was the whole purpose of the day. Far away on her island of Dragonstone, Rhaenyra had a better claim, the named and sworn inheritance, the law itself on her side. But she had no crowd. She was not there. She could not show the small folk of the capital a king made before their eyes, because the capital was not hers. While the law belonged to Rhaenyra, the city and the spectacle and the moment belonged to Otto's grandson, and the Greens made sure everyone saw it. But the other side learned of it, and quickly. There were those loyal to Rhaenyra even in the heart of the Green triumph, and word of the usurpation went out toward Dragonstone on swift wings. The dragons themselves carried the news, in the end. A princess of the blood who would not bow to the Greens took flight from the city and brought the tidings to Rhaenyra in person. Within days, the rightful heir on her island knew that her birthright had been stolen and given to her half-brother before a cheering crowd. And so, on that day, the realm came to possess the one thing no realm can survive for long. Two monarchs. There was a crowned king in King's Landing and a wronged heir on Dragonstone. Each had a claim, each had dragons, and there was now no way back to a world with only one of them. The moment the crown touched Aegon's head, the question that Viserys had spent his whole reign refusing to answer was answered, by force and by the certainty of war. The point of no return for every soul in this story had arrived. For Rhaenyra, robbed. For Aegon, given a crown he never sought. For Alicent, her son's fate now bound to a throne they could only keep by winning a war. And most of all, for Otto Hightower, the architect of it all. There was no undoing this. A crown placed before 10,000 witnesses cannot be quietly returned. Whatever happened next, Otto had committed himself and his house and the entire realm to a course from which there was no retreat. Otto Hightower had finally done it. After a lifetime of climbing, scheming, waiting, falling, and rising again, he had made his grandson a king. The single goal that had organized his entire existence was, in that moment at the dragon pit, achieved. His blood sat the Iron Throne. By every measure he had ever used to judge himself, he had won. Because everything that flowed from that crown was ruin. The war that followed would consume the realm, the dragons, the dynasty, and in the end, Otto himself. The height he had spent his life building was complete, and from it, everything he loved was about to fall. The war had a name now, though no one had spoken it yet. They would come to call it the Dance of the Dragons, and the hand of the new king sat down at last to fight it the only way he knew how. When the war came, Otto Hightower fought it with paper. The Dance of the Dragons is remembered for fire, for the great beasts wheeling over burning fields, for kin killing kin from the backs of monsters, for the most terrible weapons the world had ever known turned against one another. But it did not begin that way. In its first weeks, the war was not waged with dragons at all. It was waged with ravens, and the man directing the ravens was the king's hand. This was the only war Otto truly understood, and he set about it the way he had set about everything in his long life. He sent letters. Out of King's Landing flew a steady stream of messages to every great house in the 7 kingdoms, each one carefully composed, each one calculated to win an ally, secure a promise, or split a wavering lord away from Rhaenyra's cause. He offered honours. He proposed marriages, the oldest currency of alliance, binding houses to the king's side with the promise of joint blood. He made bargains. He reminded old debts and dangled new rewards. Otto Hightower at war looked very much like Otto Hightower at court. A patient man at a writing table, moving pieces across the whole map of the realm, without raising his voice or drawing a sword. He even sent terms to Rhaenyra herself. This was the measured course the Green Council had chosen, and Otto pursued it in earnest. A message went to Dragonstone offering the wronged heir a way out of the war before it truly began. Bend the knee to King Aegon, the offer ran, and there need be no bloodshed. She could keep her island. Her sons could keep their lands and titles. Pardons would be granted to her followers. All of it could be settled, if only Rhaenyra would accept her brother as king and lay down her claim. She refused. Of course she refused. The offer asked her to surrender the one thing that had been stolen from her in exchange for keeping the scraps of what was already hers. No wronged heir with dragons and loyal lords accepts such terms. Rhaenyra rejected the offer and answered the theft of her crown with the only answer that fitted. She meant to take it back. The diplomatic path that Otto had so carefully prepared collapsed at the first true test, exactly as the hard men of the council had warned it would. But Otto did not abandon his method. He doubled down on it. If Rhaenyra would not be bought, then the war would be won, the way wars between great factions are usually won, by gathering more strength than the other side, lord by lord and house by house. And so, the long contest for the allegiance of the realm began. The map of Westeros began to divide. Some houses leaned toward the king in his city, drawn by old ties or new bargains or simple proximity to power. The wealth of the West and the strength of Oldtown stood largely with the Greens. Others leaned toward the rightful heir on her island, bound by the oaths they had sworn to Rhaenyra years before, or by their own quarrels with the Queen's party. The Riverlands stirred for the Blacks. The far north began to gather its strength for her. Both sides counted their friends and courted the undecided. and for a time, the war was a vast and quiet competition of persuasion, conducted across thousands of miles by men who had not yet shed each other's blood. Otto was in his element, and it must be said plainly because it is the key to understanding both the man and his coming downfall. His way of fighting was not foolish. It was, in cold truth, the wisest way to wage such a war. A war of letters spills no blood. A war of marriages and bargains and terms keeps the fields unburned, the small folk alive, the realm intact for whoever finally wins it. Otto understood something that the men around him, hungry for swift victory, did not want to hear. That a kingdom won by slaughter is a kingdom not worth winning, a ruin of ash and orphans and undying hatred. He had spent his whole life keeping the realm stable. Even now, even as the author of the crisis tearing it apart, his instinct was to limit the damage, to win in a way that left something behind to rule. If the goal was to make Aegon a lasting king over a whole and living realm, then Otto's slow game of leverage was precisely the right way to play it. And that was exactly the problem. Because the slow game satisfied no one who wanted the war won quickly, and Otto was surrounded by people who wanted nothing else. The Greens had their own hard men, every bit as hungry for blood as the voices Otto had argued down in the council chamber. There was Sir Criston Cole, a soldier who believed wars were won by soldiers, not scribes. There was Prince Aemon, the king's fierce one-eyed brother, who rode the largest dragon in the world and was not inclined to leave it idle while old men traded letters. And there was the king himself. Aegon had not wanted his crown, but having taken it, and having taken the danger that came with it, he was in no mood to watch his grandfather conduct a polite correspondence while his sister gathered armies and dragons against him. To these men, Otto's caution did not look like wisdom. It looked like weakness. It looked like the realm's enemy growing stronger by the day, while the hand of the king shuffled parchment. The early months of the war came down to a quiet wager that Otto made against the entire conflict. He bet that a usurpation could be made permanent through diplomacy. He bet that the theft of a throne could be settled the way he had settled everything, through patience, leverage, and arrangement, without committing the realm to the full fury of dragon against dragon. It was a careful bet, and a humane one, and in another kind of conflict, it might even have been the winning one. It could not hold. The pressure for blood was building on both sides, in the hearts of fierce princes and frustrated kings, and pressure like that always finds its release. The diplomatic war was about to end. The war of fire was about to begin in earnest. And when the blood finally came, the men who had wanted it all along would look at the patient old hand who had counseled restraint, and they would decide they had no more use for him. The blood came, as Otto must have known in some part of himself it would, and it came in the place where his diplomacy was meant to be working hardest. While the two sides courted the great lords with letters and offers, the contest for one such lord turned deadly. Both factions sent envoys to win the allegiance of a powerful house in the Stormlands, and Rhaenyra's envoy was one of her own young sons, a boy on dragonback sent to plead his mother's cause. He came too late. The Lord had already chosen the Greens, and on the journey home, in storm and fury, he was caught by Aegon's fierce brother Aemon, who rode the oldest and largest dragon in the world. What happened in the clouds above the sea is the kind of thing this story does not need to dwell on. It is enough to say that a boy died, and a dragon died with him, and that it was kinslaying, the first great spilling of family blood in a war between one family. That death broke something that could not be mended. Rhaenyra's grief turned to fury, and her fury demanded an answer. And the answer, when it came, was a horror that even hardened men spoke of in low voices ever after. Blood was paid with blood. Deep in the Red Keep, in the dark, agents of the Queen's enemies took a life in revenge. A child of King Aegon's own house, murdered to balance the boy who had died above the storms. The details belong to Nightmare, not to this telling. What matters is what it meant. With those two deaths, a son for a son, the war stopped being a contest of letters and alliances. It became a thing of fire and vengeance, a feud between two families who would now answer every wound with a deeper one. And in that new and bloody world, Otto Hightower's patient diplomacy was suddenly worthless. Look at it from the throne. King Aegon had taken a crown he never wanted, accepted the danger that came with it, and now watched his enemies murder his blood, while his grandfather counseled patience. The diplomatic path Otto had championed had not prevented the bloodshed. It had presided over its beginning. The careful letters, the offered terms, the courting of lords. All of it had produced not a settled realm, but a dead son and a dead child, and a war turning savage by the day. To the king, his grandfather's caution no longer looked like wisdom. It looked like the reason his enemies were still alive and still striking. Aegon wanted vengeance. He wanted victory. He wanted the war fought by men who would fight it, and his grandfather was not such a man and had never pretended to be. So Aegon did to Otto what his own father had done before him. He took away the chain. The king stripped Otto Hightower of the office of hand and gave it to another. The man he chose stood apart from the patient old schemer he replaced in every way that mattered. It was Sir Criston Cole, the soldier, the Lord Commander of the King's Guard, the man who had placed the crown on Aegon's head with his own hands and was already known throughout the realm as the Kingmaker. Where Otto fought with parchment, Criston fought with steel and wanted the enemy destroyed. The king had wanted aggression, and now he had a hand who was nothing else. For Otto, this was the second fall, and it was the final one. He had been cast down once before, years ago, by Viserys, for letting his ambition show. He had spent 8 years learning to hide it, and clawed his way back to the very center of power, and achieved the one great goal of his life, his blood upon the throne. And now, with that throne secured but the war upon it raging, he was cast down again, this time by his own grandson, the king he had made. The architect of the whole enterprise, the man without whom none of it would exist, was pushed out of the room just as the thing he had built reached its most dangerous hour. There is a bitter symmetry in it. The patient man was discarded the moment patience was no longer wanted, by the very crown his patience had won. The second great fall of Otto Hightower was more than a personal defeat. It was the moment the war slipped its last restraint. For all his treason, for all his ambition, for all the catastrophe his scheming had unleashed, Otto Hightower had been throughout the one voice on the green side arguing to limit the damage. He had wanted the throne taken gently. He had wanted Rhaenyra offered terms instead of killers. He was the architect of the conflict, and also, strangely, its last break. With Otto gone from the hand seat, that break was off. There was no longer anyone of influence at Aegon's side counselling restraint. No one whose instinct was to manage the bloodshed rather than multiply it. The cautious old man was gone, and in his place stood a soldier who believed in the sword. And so, the dance of the dragons turned truly savage. Freed from Otto's restraint, the Greens fought the way the hard men had always wanted to fight. Armies marched, castles burned, Dragons met dragons in the sky and tore each other from it. The war that Otto had tried to keep small and survivable became the great cataclysm that history remembers. A conflict that would consume the dragons themselves and gut the realm and leave a generation in ash. The man who had wanted to win quietly was no longer there to want anything. The war belonged now to the men of fire. There is a hard lesson buried in this, and it is one of the strangest truths of Otto's whole story. He committed the great crime, and then he was punished for not being ruthless enough to make the crime succeed cleanly. His enemies among the blacks would never forgive him for starting the war. His allies among the Greens grew tired of him for not fighting it hard enough. He had managed to satisfy no one. So Otto Hightower stepped back from the center of power for the last time. No longer hand, no longer the architect directing events. Now only an old man watching the fire he had lit grow into something no one could control. He had spent his whole life climbing toward the moment his blood took the throne. He had reached it. And now, having reached it, he was set aside to watch what it cost. The war ground on without him, and it was carrying toward the city he had ruled for so long, the one person in all the world with the most reason to want his head. In the year 130 after Aegon's conquest, Rhaenyra Targaryen came to take what was hers, and the city Otto Hightower had ruled for so long opened its gates to her. It did not even require a great battle. By the time the rightful heir turned her dragons toward King's Landing, the green cause in the capital had hollowed out. The king, Aegon, was gone, wounded, broken, spirited out of the city to hide while his war was lost without him. His fierce brother Aemon and the largest dragon in the world were far away in the Riverlands. The defenders who remained looked up at the sky, saw dragons circling that they could not hope to fight, and made the only choice that kept them alive. The gold cloaks, the very city watch that Daemon had built and armed decades before, threw open the gates. The small folk who had once roared for Aegon at the dragon pit now lined the streets for the queen who had come to claim her birthright. King's Landing fell to Rhaenyra almost without a sword being raised, and she rode into the heart of the realm, and at last sat the iron throne her father had promised her. And then the reckoning began. Rhaenyra had not forgotten. She knew exactly who had done this to her, who had gathered in secret over her father's cooling body, who had crowned her brother before a cheering crowd, who had sent her terms that asked her to surrender her own inheritance. The men of the Green Council had stolen her crown, and now the crown was hers again, and the men were within her reach. She ordered them taken. One by one, the architects of the usurpation were hunted down and dragged before the queen they had denied. Their fates were not all the same, and the differences tell their own story. The Master of Coin, Tywin Lannister, was put to torment to make him reveal where the crown's treasure had been hidden, and he suffered terribly for it. The Grand Maester, who had served the Greens, was imprisoned, and Queen Alicent, Otto's daughter, the woman who had carried his cause across all those years, was spared the worst. She was Rhaenyra's own stepmother, blood by marriage, and whatever lay between the two women, Rhaenyra did not take her life. Alicent was put in chains and held a prisoner. She would live, but she would live to watch what came next, and to grieve through everything that followed. For her father, there would be no chains and no prison. Otto Hightower was taken, the most patient man in Westeros, the second son, who had climbed higher than any second son had a right to, the maker of a king. He was seized and brought before the woman he had spent his life keeping off the throne. There is something almost unbearable in the symmetry of it. For decades, Otto had operated from the shadows behind the throne, the hand at the king's elbow, the voice in the council, the man who arranged outcomes and let others take the stage. Now he stood in the open with no office, no king to shield him, no scheme left to deploy, before the rightful heir he had overthrown, with nothing between himself and her judgment. Rhaenyra condemned him to die. There was a cold justice in singling him out above the others. Thailand had managed coin. Orwyle had pushed parchment. Alicent had been a mother fighting for her sons. But Otto was the architect. He was the one who had convened the council, set aside her claim, and put the crown on Aegon's head. If any single man bore the weight of the theft of her throne, it was the old hand of Oldtown. So the woman he had denied passed sentence on the man who had denied her, and the sentence was death. They brought him out to the steps of the Red Keep, the great seat of kings he had ruled in all but name for so much of his life, the heart of the realm he had spent his decades maneuvering toward and finally, briefly, holding. There, on the steps of the keep that had been the center of his whole world, they made him kneel. The histories say he met his end without breaking. Whatever fear an old man feels at such a moment, Otto did not give his enemies the satisfaction of seeing it. He had been many things across his long life, patient, calculating, ruthless, proud. He knelt where they bid him kneel, and he laid his head upon the block, and the cold composure that had carried him through a lifetime of court and conspiracy did not desert him in the last moment. What followed is best left where such things belong, in silence. It is enough to say that the most powerful man in Westeros died on the steps of the keep he had ruled, on the order of the heir he had cast aside, and that his life's long climb ended there on the cold stone, the single point toward which everything has been moving since a second son first looked up at a tower in Oldtown he would never inherit. The architect of the usurpation died at the hands of the rightful heir he had overthrown. The patience, the ambition, the crowning, the war, the fall, all of it ends on those steps. The planner was outplanned. Think of what this man had done in his time. He had destroyed Prince Daemon, the boldest and most dangerous man in the realm, with nothing more than a whisper carried to a grieving king. He had married his daughter to a monarch and put his blood in the line of kings. He had crowned a king in secret, gathering a council in the dark and presenting the realm with a king made before it knew the old one was dead. He had spent a lifetime arranging outcomes, moving men like pieces, winning through patience what others could not win through force. He was, by any measure, one of the great schemers in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. And in the end, none of it could save him. For all his planning, he died because of the one thing his planning could not control. He could not keep the city. When the dragons came and the gates opened, all the patience and all the leverage and all the careful arrangement in the world meant nothing. Power in that final hour did not belong to the man with the cleverest plan. It belonged to the woman with the dragons. The schemer's whole method, manage, persuade, arrange, wait, had no answer to fire over the walls and an army at the gates. He had built his entire life on the belief that the patient and the clever inherit the realm, and he died learning that sometimes they do not. Sometimes the realm goes to whoever can take it and hold it, and Otto, at the last, could do neither. So the woman he had denied took his head on the steps of the keep he had ruled. The man who had spent decades keeping her from the throne watched her sit it, and then died on her command, in the place he had loved best, the seat of all his ambition turned into the place of his execution. Otto Hightower was dead. The war he had lit was not. That is the cruelest fact of his ending. He did not even live to see the worst of what he had loosed. The fire he had started on a quiet night over a dead king's body went on burning long after the man who lit it was gone. And one by one it took everything he had spent his life trying to win. It took Rhaenyra first. Her triumph in King's Landing, the moment she finally sat the throne her father had promised her, lasted only a season. The city that had opened its gates to her soon turned against her. The small folk who had lined the streets came to hate her and rose, and in their fury even the dragons in the dragon pit were not safe from them. Rhaenyra was driven from the capital she had just taken, hunted and abandoned, her support collapsing around her. She fled at last to Dragonstone, the island that had always been her refuge, and found her half-brother Aegon waiting there, returned in secret. The woman who had taken Otto's head was given to Aegon's dragon. It is enough to say she died, as so many died in that war, by dragonfire, and that her son was made to watch. The rightful heir was gone, devoured, within a year of her victory. But there was no victory in it for Aegon either. His win was hollow from the start. He was a broken man by then, crippled and in constant pain from wounds that could not heal, ruling over a realm that lay in ruins beneath him. He had his throne back, and his sister dead, and almost nothing else. And he did not keep even that for long. Within the year, his own people poisoned him. Quietly, to end a war that no one could any longer bear. The king Otto had made, the grandson he had given everything to crown, died poisoned and ruined, leaving no son to follow him. With his death, the dance of the dragons finally gutted out, not because either side had won, but because there was almost nothing left to fight over. The throne passed in the end to a child of the very line Otto had tried to destroy, a son of Rhaenyra, raised to rule a realm gutted by his elders' war. The Greens had not won. The Blacks had not won. Both sides had simply bled until they could bleed no more. And the dragons paid the highest price of all. This is the wound the dance left that never healed. The Targaryens were what they were because of their dragons. Those were the source of their power, the thing that set them above all other men, the closest thing to magic the world still held. The dance of the dragons consumed them. Beast killed beast in the skies until the skies emptied. By the end of the war, nearly all of them were dead, and the handful that survived dwindled away in the years that followed until there were none. The greatest power the world had known burned itself out in a family quarrel over a chair, and it never came back. Otto Hightower had wanted his grandson to sit upon dragons. Instead, he helped to kill them. But the heaviest weight of all, for Otto, would have been his daughter. Alicent lived. Rhaenyra spared her, and so she did not die on the block beside her father. She survived in chains, and survived to learn what survival meant. One by one, the war took her children from her. Her sons died, in battle, in betrayal, in the long, grinding violence of it. Her daughter was lost to a grief too deep to carry. By the end, Alicent Hightower had outlived all of them. The woman her father had placed at the side of a dying king, the queen he had built his whole project around, the mother who had carried his cause through every year of his absence. She was left alone in her confinement, with nothing but the memory of children she had buried. She had wanted, like any mother, only to see her son safe and her family raised high. She got the opposite of everything. She lived on for a few more grieving years, and then she, too, was gone. And the great prize? The thing Otto had given his entire life to seize, Hightower blood upon the Iron Throne of the Seven Kingdoms. It turned to ash in his hands. The king he crowned died without an heir to follow him. The royal line he had worked decades to create simply ended. Oldtown still stood. The tower still burned its beacon over the harbour. House Hightower endured as it always had. But the dream that had driven Otto, the dream of his blood ruling the realm, died with his grandson and was never revived. Everything he had built came to nothing, less than nothing. It came to a pile of graves with his family's names on them. So now, at the end, we can see the whole shape of the man's life and say plainly what it amounted to. Otto Hightower got the one thing he spent his life reaching for. His blood touched the Iron Throne. By the measure he had used to judge himself from boyhood, he succeeded where almost no second son ever could, and it brought nothing but graves. His grandson, dead and heirless. His daughter, alive only to mourn. His other grandchildren, in the ground. The dragons, gone from the world. The realm, gutted. And himself, beheaded on the steps of the keep he had ruled, condemned by the rightful heir he had cast aside. The second son, who climbed so carefully, who built his ascent stone by patient stone over the course of a lifetime, built a height from which everything he loved would fall. The final irony is the one that defines him forever. Otto Hightower was the most careful man in Westeros. Patience was his whole nature. He destroyed his enemies slowly, advanced his family slowly, waited decades for moments other men would have seized in haste. He believed, to his bones, in caution, in management, in the long, quiet game. He spent his life avoiding the reckless stroke, and he is remembered for the most reckless thing anyone in his age ever did. All his patience, all his cunning, all his lifelong horror of the rash and the bloody, none of it stopped him from lighting the single most ruinous fire in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. The careful man did the reckless thing, and the recklessness outlived the man and consumed the world. That is the story of Otto Hightower, a landless second son who looked up at a tower he could never inherit and decided he would build a higher one of his own.